to the year of 1915 in many ways were the founding years for Sweden as a modern industrialized country. What really makes you jump, though, is when you look at the development, is the pace where so much was achieved in only 50 years. Many of the large Swedish companies that we'll know to this day, you see some of them here, were founded during this period and quickly developed to become international yet global actors. Underpinning all this was free trade. There was a wide open world market that never before had been more welcoming to cross-border trade and labor exchange. In this day of border discussions, it's worth remembering that passports were not even required then to pass borders. That of course changed when World War I broke out. In hindsight, it is clear that this was the most free trade friendly period the world had seen so far. For daring entrepreneurs, the opportunities of these times were almost unlimited. Yes, credit should be given to statesmen and dignitaries, but what development really needs is entrepreneurs, individuals of flesh and blood who will not stop until they have seen their ideas realized. Here you see two of them. They are one of the true power couples of Swedish business, Lars Magnus and Hilda Erickson. Only a stone's throw away from where we are today, on Drottninggatan, they started a small company that bears their name to this day. Back then, though, it was a company whose finances the couple could keep track of in this little ledger. In it, they each evening wrote down wages and business accounts by hand. While Lars Magnus traveled the whole world and struck deals, Hilda kept the organization running at home in Sweden and was, practically speaking, the company's chief operating officer, if not chief executive officer, except for officially, of course. I like to say that Lars Magnus and Hilda Erickson ran the company according to the principle of MBLL, or Management by Love Letters. Here is one such love letter from Lars Magnus. We find him preparing for the Paris exhibition of 1900. He writes about all the work there is to do, that there has been a fire in the basement and that dust covers Ericsson's exhibition booth. But he is also self-confident, almost celebratory, since he finds the American and German competitors at the fair less than impressive. Well, history gave him right, and Ericsson became, and still is, a global forerunner in its field. So from its early days, just next door to here, the LM Ericsson and company had by 1915 reached a position where it was a globally operating corporation with activities on all continents. Ericsson was of course present in France too, since the early 1900s. Its French subsidiary Société Française de Téléphone Erickson, STE, was established in 1911, and the following year the company's plant was completed in Colombes, a Paris suburb. And the French path that Ericsson paved was followed by many other Swedish companies. Alfa Laval, who sold products that revolutionized milk production, began operations in Courbevoie in the 1920s, almost the same time as Electrolux did it. AGA, who delivered lighthouses soon thereafter, and later on Atlas Copco, whose pneumatic drills came into handy for the tunnel system that links Paris with neighboring Neuilly, Etoile, and La Défense. In more recent times, retailers such as IKEA and H&M, of course, have built large businesses in France. We have seen that in 1915, when the Swedish Chamber of Commerce in France was founded, Sweden had built a solid position in the world economy. As a nation, we had irrevocably signed up for a development that demands openness, curiosity, and adaptation. Just look at this image, which shows how one company during 100 years took its path into a global market. There is, in no other words, no looking back, no room for nostalgia. As the world spins, we will continue to spin with it. And I am happy to note that also today our companies are there at the forefront, even in a global web environment, when you have to be international from day one. In many ways, this is still the spirit of Gripenstedt's rendering of Bastia, ideas of borderless trade and service, and how it became the dominant way of policymaking in so many countries. All this makes me curious. I wonder what my successor will say in another 100 years, when he or she reflects about the newcomers of today. Who is still there from Spotify, Klarna, or Mojang, or Deezer, Vente Privé, Dailymotion, or BlaBlaCar? And will it be able to say then too that we as countries continue to benefit from free trade, thriving in the knowledge that change shouldn't be feared but embraced as the seed for success? Let us also hope that the countries that are just joining the free trade arena will stick to this belief over the 100 years to come. Well, the only thing I myself as an historian know is that history never ends. It has just only begun, and therefore let us greet the future with a message from Gustav Dahlén, who we encountered earlier in this presentation. He wore this pin on his sleeve, Var optimist, be an optimist, as myself. It is without a doubt an exciting and an inspiring development we have seen in the past 100 years, and that we all look forward to meeting in the next 100. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. What a great start of this afternoon. What do you think is the main learning from history for the entrepreneurs, maybe the companies that we saw on your last slide, the Swedish companies that want to enter the French market going forward?
I think you should trust in what you can achieve. You should take advantage in engineering skills and entrepreneurship, and also the fact that we Swedish always have think globally, or most often think globally when it comes to building companies, and that is a prerequisite for going to success when you are a small country and a small language. And I think our French partners can benefit from this fact. There are a lot of examples where Swedish and French companies have joined together in cooperation and grown very fast. So I think that's the thing, really.
Another thing I thought about when you showed your last slide is it must be pretty difficult to be a historian and to run an archive these days, because all communication is digital and it just vanishes. So how do you do that?
We do that by digitizing a lot of materials, but also we are sampling a lot of digital material from our companies like Atlas Copco or Erickson or Electrolux, and every one of them.
So your predecessors, they will...
I would say that. And I am an optimist.
Okay. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you.
We will move on to our next keynote speaker, who is one of Sweden's most accomplished and experienced diplomats. And he will give us a speech on Sweden and France, a European friendship, which sounds very poetic. And I'm very happy to introduce Frank Belfrage, who has been the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs in Sweden, and also our ambassador to France, among many, many other things. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Gita, our president. As Gita was very rightly saying, we are looking at the future, but we are basing this vision of the future also on a blick on the hindsight and from where do we come from and how has this relation between France and Sweden been built over the years. Because it goes a long way back. I would say it really started in somewhat of a paradox at the end of the first millennium, when the Vikings, in their brutal warfare, were occupying parts of Paris, firing along the Seine, and then occupying parts of Normandy. But it all changed pretty rapidly, and the warriors became dynamic tradesmen. And I would like to think that they made a significant contribution to their new homeland. In the story of the European story of France and Sweden, there are two red threads: trade and investments, and foreign and security policies, and interchanging over the years. But I would say possibly with a slight more emphasis on trade and investments. The builder of the Swedish nation, or the godfather of the Swedish nation as we today know it, Gustav Vasa, created in the 16th century a platform from which Sweden would approach the continent, as we said already in those days. The Kalmar Union, we remember, with Denmark had been phased out, and Gustav Vasa was on the outlook for allies in order to counter the dominant position and the monopoly position of the Hansa. And this suited the French King François I, France first, pretty well, because he was also the outlook for allies, because he was wanting to counteract the House of Habsburg in Central Europe. And from these contacts and friendship, the very first agreement between France and Sweden came in 1542, and it was built on two elements: mutual commitments on defense and security, and long, far-reaching free trade commitments. So there you see security policy and trade policy going hand in hand. A little bit later on in the next century, when we had the 30 Years' War, we had again somewhat of a paradox, which was a very solid basis for the Franco-Swedish friendship. We see Lutheran Sweden approaching and closing in to the Catholic Cardinal Richelieu, who was in fact ruling France, and both joining hands in a war which was about religions. You will admit that this was somewhat of a paradox, but again, power politics and security issues were the overarching motives which explain these rather odd relations, which developed into a very strong one, given the fact that Sweden was building its empire and France was again looking for allies against the Habsburgs. Simultaneously, and just after that, of course, we had also immense French philosophical influence on Sweden, household names such as Rousseau, Voltaire, Descartes, had great influence on Swedish thinking, and mainly, of course, through their main vehicle, which was Queen Christina, the daughter of Gustav Adolphus, the father of the then Swedish empires. In the 18th century, things change. The relations between Sweden and France, still very friendly, differ in different ways, or they develop in different ways. We have the French subsidies to Sweden, Sweden which was weakened by the wars with Russia, and of course there were some strings attached. France was expecting support from Sweden in the power politics of Europe. We had also, of course, very deep cultural and scientific links. We see today still the very mark of them by the way in which Stockholm Royal Castle is built and its interior, still very much marked by the French artistic visions of the time. We have also some emotional elements. We all remember the participation of Axel von Fersen at the court of Versailles, and historians are still disputing and discussing about how close were his links to Queen Marie Antoinette. And then, to crown this all, the 18th century, we were given a colony. Perhaps we not always remember, but the island of Saint-Barthélemy in the Caribbean was for 100 years a Swedish colony, and it's a long story, a very interesting one how we got it, but I think it would fall outside the frame of this conference, but we can come back to it. In the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, early 19th century, and in the turbulences related to the succession on the throne of Sweden, a new turning point in the Franco-Swedish relations occur. The Swedish Parliament elects as its next crown prince in 1810 one of the field marshals of Napoleon, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, who then, after having been crowned King of Sweden, becomes the first in a dynasty which is today still very much on the throne of Sweden, and we are of course immensely proud today to have in our midst Crown Princess Victoria. I think it's fair to say that the Swedes were hoping somewhere, tacitly, that Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte would help them reconquer Finland